One of the biggest mistakes Christians make is they don't differentiate between the works of the law versus good deeds. They are not the same. Paul tells us we're not justified by the works of the law. In Galatians 2 verse 16, we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Christ Jesus. That we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because by the works of the law, no one will be justified. Works of the law are not the same as good deeds. Now, I bring this up because there's two mistakes that Christians make. There are those like Seventh-day Adventists, offshoots, sometimes Messianic congregations that require its members to observe the Sabbath and kosher foods and other things like that. And they'll tell them, if you don't, you're breaking God's commandments and you won't be saved. That's a lie. That's completely contradicting what Paul is talking about here. But then there are those Christians who say that as long as someone puts their faith in Christ, then they don't need to have good deeds or good fruit in order to show that they're saved. In fact, they could even become more wicked after they put their faith in Christ, and they're still going to heaven because no one is justified by good deeds. No, because they're confusing good deeds with works of the law. So what's the difference between good deeds and works of the law? The Apostle Paul differentiates this in Romans chapter 13. He mentions verse 9, the commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to their neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So the parts of the Old Testament that relate to loving my neighbor, I keep. But those external regulations that have no bearing on loving others, I don't keep. For example, you go to worship on Saturday. God bless you. Do what you want, but it doesn't tell me that you're loving your neighbor. Whether you abstain from pork or shellfish, that doesn't tell me whether you love your neighbor, because it's just food that goes into your mouth, into your stomach, and out. That's what Jesus said. Those things, whether you wear clothing with different material, that doesn't show any bearing. Yet under the Old Testament commandment, you could not wear clothing with two different materials. You see, none of those regulations have any bearing on whether you love each other. So you have that mistake of the Seventh-day Adventists, some Messianic congregations, where they make the external observances to be paramount for salvation, and they are not. Then you get the other side where you don't have to produce good deeds and you could be wicked and you're still saved. Both teachings are wrong. The way we fulfill the law is not by the external observances, it's by loving each other.